Thank you very much, Ellen, for that brief introduction, which is always the best. And I have to make some thanks as well, because I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for Celia, for Lee Pollock, and for Alan Packwood. I'm not a Churchill scholar, although I hope I'm a Churchillian now, and might one day deserve that accolade. I'm very grateful for not only the invitation, but also the support I got from all three of them during the project so far. I should say that I'm a bit here under false pretenses. You know that Canadians always start with an apology anyway. That's part of the national tradition. But this is only going to be about Churchill's first visit to Cuba in 1895. It's not going to be about his 1946 visit or about his subsequent interest in the island, which is interesting in itself. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of a number of veterans of Celia's visit to Cuba in February. They are still alive, despite my best efforts. I'm not sure they're prospering. I heard a few coughs during the visit that may remind me of the worst days. But I am truly honored to be in this company, particularly of Churchill scholars, but just of Churchillians in general, and I hope the real ones around the room will think about helping me get a little bit better at some of this and understanding particularly the Cuban aspect, but not only the Cuban aspect. Perhaps Dr. Russell would be good enough to do that as well. A word on the project, if I may. I was long aware, of course, that Churchill, everybody in Cuba is aware that Churchill was somehow on the island at some time during one of the revolutions. I'm never quite sure which. But I at least thought that what was known was what there was to be known, and at a 2012 conference in Havana, actually on the taking of Havana by the British 240 years before, I met a Cuban academic who told me that she was sure that wasn't true, and she put me on to a number of leads, which I was then able to work a bit on. And I discovered from the very first day I worked on it, on this particular subject, that was a tremendous amount that had not been unearthed, and that it really was something very, very new and exciting. And as all people who work on Churchill know, it's not all that easy to find something exciting. So that I wondered more than once out loud why no one had taken up the challenge of what are only 18 days actually on the island, but which are months of preparation and then years of discussion subsequently and of publication on the island. It seems to me that the big challenges were languages, obviously. One needs both languages, but particularly for Cuban scholars, Churchill's visceral anti-communism made, at least in the last 56 years, it very difficult for Cubans to think about studying this man and getting the support they needed from the government to do so, as well as the fact that, of course, the Cuban financial situation, the economic situation, doesn't allow for money for UK prices, and particularly London prices, as I know everyone in this room knows. So the Cubans were more or less out. And also on the other side, United States scholars, and there are of course many who work on Cuba, faced the problem of United States restrictions on going to Cuba for research. And even British scholars, with the close relationship with the United States, sometimes found there were more than even the usual Cuban bureaucratic obstacles to work. And so that access to Spanish archives would have been relatively easy, but certainly not to Cuban. And since I discovered that it was possible to find out a lot more about this very formative moment in Churchill's life, which I hope I'll show in the next few minutes, it seemed to me, if you'll excuse the expression, almost a duty, because Canadians have easy access to Cuba for a number of reasons. Obviously, I have the languages from working in that field, and I had access to all three of the national archives, Spain's, Cuba's, and UK's, with ease. So it seemed almost a duty to work on that, and I have a book coming out on the subject in the first week of July with the History Press. Enough on the subject. I'm going to try to use PowerPoint. Now, I'm a historian. PowerPoint, my students always say that when I give a PowerPoint presentation, there's a lot more power than point. I hope you don't find that to be the case, but I am going to try to use these because some experts have told me how this can work out. I'd also like to put in a plug that I had a photographer, a wonderful photographer, with me for the three major visits to the battlefields, etc., that Churchill where Churchill was, and the many railway stations as the visitors to Cuba in February noted there seemed to be a great many railways, perhaps too many railway stations being visited in the tour. The curious thing that, of course, in Cuba, for all sorts of reasons you can well imagine, everything Churchill saw essentially is still standing. There hasn't been much construction in the last 56 years, and so you really can get more than just a feel for things. So I hope you'll enjoy some of the photographs. Glenn Hartle, the chap in question, is taking over Chartwell in the month of June with an exhibition of those photos for any of you who find the subject of Churchill in Cuba in 1895 interesting. Well, of course, look at that. Oh, the book. How odd that I would happen to have that. I don't know how that slipped in. In 1895, of course, we're talking about a 20-year-old. I really think this is important. We're talking about a 20-year-old. He's just graduated from Sandhurst, and frankly, he's looking for a war. You might say that was something that wasn't just in 1895, but he has 4 things he wants to do, and they're very clear things to do. He wants to prove himself under fire, but he wants to do it in what he calls a private rehearsal. He wants not to be, as so many subalterns have dreamt about doing, me included, not being with your own troops when you have that supreme test. And having been bullied at school, of course, he's very sensitive to the fact that he may not be cut out for a military life. So he wants to prove himself under fire. He wants to have a real adventure. Perhaps I should put that as the first one. If possible, he'd like to make some money, which he proceeds to do. And he'd like to begin to make himself famous because he's already bored with the army and he's already thinking of how he might eventually leave it and enter politics. I'm going to have to do 2 of these, I guess. This is, of course, the only war he finds. Pax Britannica is in full swing. The Sino-Japanese War, which seemed like it would carry on a bit longer, doesn't. The Japanese surprise attacks are successful. The war is very short. It ends in April. So there's literally only one war to go to. How unusual. Sounds like a dream in the 2000 teens, doesn't it? And there's only one war to go to, and it's the rebellion in Cuba, which has broken out in February of that year, Cuba's second attempt at independence. The island only 90 miles south of the United States, but for those of you who have visited it, quite different from the United States. The 4th Hussars, his regiment, 4th Queen's Own Hussars, are in the most boring of postings and duties imaginable. They're in Aldershot. I have nothing against Aldershot, but they're in Aldershot doing peacetime duties that are not, to say the least, very exciting. And as I mentioned, Winston is already bored. They're a proud and historic regiment, but they haven't actually seen action since the Crimea. Not the sort of thing that Churchill was really imagining, that he would spend perhaps the next 40 years without seeing action either. This is a uniform that they've just been issued because, of course, they've just been told off that they're going to go to India in the new year, 1896. And as a result of that, they, like as usual, postings to India could be up to 9 years. He would get, and they would, the other officers would get, and indeed the men would get, a long leave before they went. So he buys his uniforms. This becomes important as well, not just because of their effect on his pocketbook. He needs, of course, a number of things. First, he needs a companion because nobody's going to buy the idea of his going alone. And he has a very good friend already. He calls him perhaps my best friend in the person of Reginald Barnes, seen there as a major. I haven't found a picture of him as a lieutenant yet that's quite so good. Barnes is a very interesting fellow in his own right, and I'm hoping to do some work on him while I'm here in the UK this time. But the crucial things are he's, especially to convince Mama, the crucial things are he's 4 years older, he's a full lieutenant, so a senior subaltern, he has 6 years in the army already, he's very steady, as Churchill says, and is indeed the assistant adjutant. For those of you who know the Commonwealth armies, that means already he's noted as an officer of some importance. He goes on to become not only honorary colonel of the regiment, the fourth, but also a major general, a distinguished military career both in South Africa and in the First World War. He also, of course, will need the support of his commanding officer. That's the way it works in the army. And his commanding officer is an extraordinary chap named Brabazon, Jean Palmer Brabazon, who is a colonel, something of a socialite in Britain, but who is also very aware that while British formal policy is support for Spain, public opinion is overwhelmingly pro-Cuban. Nonetheless, he buys the idea. Mama is, of course, another question. She calls the whole affair a foolish business and is very concerned, although she is assuaged by the fact that Reggie Barnes will go with him. But, of course, 1895 was a year, as was pointed out yesterday, of death for Winston, losing his father in January, his maternal grandmother in the early spring, and the greatest impact, probably the loss of his governess and best friend, Elizabeth Everest, in July. It was an extraordinary year. Mama, however, is eventually convinced, perhaps largely by Reggie's presence, and she's soon in action, as she will be in action for many years to come. And she communicates directly with the commander-in-chief, perhaps with the prime minister. We're not quite so sure where his letter of introduction from the prime minister comes, from Salisbury. But she goes straight to the top, and he's then allowed to go to the top. And through, and this second lieutenant, straight out of Sandhurst, is now talking to Lord Wolseley with several medals, 60 years of experience, and a distinguished officer who is just being appointed to the commander-in-chief position. He hasn't even been to Balmoral for the kissing of hands yet, and he's a bit nervous about what the complications, diplomatic and otherwise, might be. But he eventually buys the idea, reluctantly, and sends Churchill and Barnes off to see this man, who is Sir Edward Chapman, who is the Director of Military Intelligence, who gives Churchill a job to do, which is to check out a new rifle, and particularly a new rifle round with smokeless powder, something for obvious reasons interests the British Army. So Churchill and Barnes now have a job to do in Cuba, which is to check out the use of this Spanish rifle and round. So we've now got not just an adventurer, but we've got somebody in the intelligence business as well. It's perhaps worth noting that as we're at Blenheim, the coincidences are extraordinary, as so often in Churchill's life. He's actually going to speak to Wolseley on the same week that Wolseley, who's writing a biography before Churchill himself of the first Duke of Marlborough, when Wolseley is invited to Blenheim to spend a week with the family and to talk about and also look at the family archives. It would have been very difficult for him, however reluctant he might have been to say yes to Churchill. It would have been very difficult for him to say no to Churchill the same week he was going to be visiting Churchill's relatives. But as if those coincidences weren't enough, Churchill has a very good personal friend, a friend of the family, and who is said to have been the person who gave him his first toy soldiers, is the British ambassador in Madrid, Sir Henry Drummond Wolff. He just happens to be in Madrid, and he starts to work with the Spanish. The thought is, in Churchill's mind, that this is going to be difficult. In fact, it's going to be very easy because the Spanish see this as a political coup, or at least a potential political coup. Not because of Winston's fame, but of course because of his father's fame. If they can show to the Cuban rebels that Britain is backing Spain, then what are the chances that the Cuban rebellion will succeed? The previous two had failed. What would suggest that this would succeed if the greatest imperial power on earth supports Spain? So the Spanish immediately give all the permissions and are simply delighted with the Churchill visit, which is now a political matter. Not for Churchill, perhaps, but it's going to be later. And we see in following the Spanish or pro-Spanish press, already from the day they leave Liverpool on the 2nd of November of that year, the Spanish are already following them publicly, suggesting each time that they are going to agregarse a, join the Spanish army, which of course not at all their intention. Their intention is to merely observe the war. Well, they go over to as far as New York on the Etruria, a great Cunard liner, but of course that's not going to last forever, and eventually they take the train to Key West, well, actually to Tampa. As most of you know, there was no train service to Key West, and they board this less dramatically impressive vessel with which they sail to this amazing place, which he considers presenting a spectacle in every respect magnificent, which is the harbor and port of Havana in that year. And he refers to the magnificent castle of the Morro, which is his first sight as he comes out of a storm and through the sea. Our visit in February didn't have that privilege. He's met by the consul and taken up to the, I wonder why that I didn't mean for that to happen. I meant for the writing to come on the wall. Can anyone see that writing? On that morning, he's taken up to his hotel. The hotel at the time had one floor less, but it's still where he stayed. And he immediately starts to smoke Cuban cigars and to eat Cuban oranges, both of which I recommend to you. He is then immediately taken, this is going quickly, he is, not only this, but in the visit, he is taken to see the commander, the second in command on the island, Major General Jose Arderios, an interesting chap in himself, who interviewed them, told them about the difficulties, and told them they were heading off tomorrow to join a Spanish column. It's very interesting to me, at least, that from the very beginning, he says that he appreciates this as a gesture of support from Spain's oldest ally. If Britain is Spain's oldest ally, I'd hate to see its oldest enemy, but there you are. These are the things you say when people come to visit, and off he goes. And so the very next day, he is, this is where he met Arderios, and then he's off to Santa Clara, which, if you recall, is sort of a third of the way along the island from Havana, and he crosses the square of from the railway station to visit and meet the Captain General. And the Captain General is a chap named Martinez Campos, a great hero in Spanish political history for some, not so heroic for others, who has been brought back to finish off the rebels just as he had done so in the previous two wars. Things are not going well for Spain. The Cubans have made remarkable successes in the previous weeks and are about to break into the wealthy west of the island through what was called the trench line, the trocha, to which reference will be made later. He then goes to a railway station in Cienfuegos on the southern coast. The railway station is painted in the same colors to this day. And then by sea to another railway station. I'll move quickly before I get criticism from the visitors. And then he has his first experience of real danger. He goes by rail through essentially rebel-held countryside past the very dangerous Escambray Mountains to the town of Santi Espiritus. He refers to this area as the most dangerous and disturbed in the whole island. And indeed, they're held back at that previous railway station for 2 days, while very frustrated young men as they're trying to get their military experience and their adventure going. This is a view of the war zone in which he goes, and as you can see, he arrives by rail as far as Santa Clara, and told he has to go to Cienfuegos, by sea to Tunas de Sasa, up by rail to Santi Espiritus, and there he joins the column. He doesn't like Santi Espiritus. It's absolutely beautiful now, but I don't think it was very beautiful then. And he goes to a column that is led by this man, who he describes as a man of great courage. And he leaves from this headquarters, and many of you may have seen his description. This is his first day when he's going towards a war zone. The very first time he's got his pistol loaded. He's in combat uniform, that is in the tropical uniform for action of the day. He's very excited, to say the least. And that column goes through, believe it or not, the Royal Road. You can imagine what the Republican roads are looking like if this is what the Royal Road looks like. And he immediately makes extremely interesting in his letters back to the Daily Graphic, because I haven't mentioned that he's also a journalist. In order to make that money, he has been hired by the Daily Graphic to do sketches and articles, 5 articles for the newspaper, the most important illustrated newspaper in the world at the time. And so he is making money. He's on his adventure. He's going to see a battle. He doesn't know that when he goes down this road. But he already starts his first military analysis ever published at this time about what it means to be on a path like this, debouching with only 1 or 2 men in the front not being able to use your cavalry for reconnaissance, and all sorts of other interesting things that in greater detail one can talk about. He arrives at the village of Arroyo Blanco, a fortified village. This is the Spanish headquarters there. But it's pretty clear the Spanish don't tell him anything. Things are not going well. He doesn't speak Spanish. They're all communicating in French. His French, I think, as Celia has suggested more than once, was probably better than he himself admitted. He uses French for his whole 18 days there and seems to have got the main points across. But the Spanish aren't interested in two British officers. And if they or anyone else had known he was a journalist, they would have been even less interested in sharing information with him. As far as we know, no one knew. It's not even clear if his mother knew that he was going to be writing criticisms and articles on the campaign while he was there. He certainly didn't share that information with the Spanish. This is the Churchill table at the manse of the local priest. There's all kinds of local lore surrounding his visit, as you can imagine. That was the path that he goes out. On the 30th of November, his birthday, after 2 days in Arroyo Blanco, he heads out to the front. There is no front, but to engage the rebels. The rebels have arrived very close. They have crossed that trench line. It's a disaster for Spanish policy and their chances of winning the war. It's not going well at all. But he makes some wonderful sketches. These, of course, are not the originals. They're worked up by the daily graphic artist. This is the infantry. He's extraordinarily impressed with Spanish infantry. And we were lucky enough to find a picture of them, the unit he was with, just a few days after his main action. Cubans like to imagine that he was in a hussar uniform, gloriously accoutred as the 1890s uniform and dashing around the Cuban countryside. He was no madman. He was not going to be dressed like that. He was dressed in a way that would be the least likely to be shot at. But he is shot at, but not on that day. And I know you're all going to leap on me and massacre me, but he was not shot at. The Spanish archives are absolutely clear on the issue. He was shot at on the 1st of December, but of course it makes a much better story to be fired at on your 21st birthday than on the day after your 21st birthday. But he's fired on for 2 days, and the culmination is not a battle, but it's not a skirmish either. It's a real action at this place. As you will see in a moment, he does a sketch from this ground. This is where he comes. The rebels are in the far forward positions behind those trees. Those trees are a lot shorter in 1895. They're probably not the same trees. I don't know a lot about palm trees. Perhaps they are the same trees. The Spanish deploy, and they engage in a firefight. Churchill can't really figure out what he should do, because he's mounted in the middle of this staff. He's getting most of the fire from the enemy, falling on, obviously, the general, who's on a white horse, the usual traditional things, and he's right next to him. But since nobody else is taking cover, he doesn't take cover either, and Barnes doesn't either, which actually ends up very nicely, as we will see. The Spanish drive the rebels off. It's declared a great victory because Spain needs a great victory. Sound familiar? It's actually not a victory at all. The rebels are already moving off west in a victorious march. The last thing they want to do is be held up by what is still a very small infantry column when they're overwhelmingly cavalry moving off to the major political advantages they can get from striking farther west. In any case, the Spanish declare it a victory. There is at least 10 minutes of heavy fire, but Churchill is under fire in one fashion or another for a day and a half. It's only heavy fire for 10 minutes, but this is not a skirmish in terms of his own and Barnes's own baptism of fire. This was the central point that the Spanish were aiming at. The Cubans were late getting their kit out of this river. They were washing and doing other things, and the camp followers were there. And, of course, Churchill crosses just at this ford point. We know most of this because, of course, he sketches, has an idea from the saddle, and we can see exactly the same scene with the palm trees a little less clear as the Spanish artillery is deploying immediately in front of Churchill and the commander. Also remarkable, but not really for most of you who study him, more coincidence, more extraordinary situation. He's only 1 kilometer away from the greatest hero of Cuban history in probably one of the most important actions. They've finally crossed successfully the trench line for what will eventually be independence. Maximo Gomez, considered the Napoleon of guerrilla warfare. And he's only a couple of hundred yards from Antonio Maceo, his second-in-command, the hero of all Cubans, the Titan of bronze. He's very impressed with the machete. He finds the Cubans very bad shots, which is not surprising because they don't have any ammunition to practice with, but he's very impressed with their machete, which is not a nice thing to meet on a warm, even a warm Cuban night. He moves on the next day to have lunch with the commanders of the Trocha at the headquarters of the Spanish, still there. And this is a Trocha. This is one point in it. You can see a fairly sophisticated defensive line. The Spanish were determined to keep the rebels in the poor east and not allow them to go to the west. And this was really what it was all about. He goes to the southern coast, and now it's the return. He gets on this extremely uncomfortable ship. The admiral commanding the Spanish fleet in Cuba said that going into the wardroom was like putting yourself through the slot of a pillar box and mailing yourself. So he wasn't very comfortable. He was on 2 of those for the return to Cienfuegos. He then relaxes in a lovely hotel in Santa Clara where he had started this 2 weeks before. And they were the center of attention, again, because of his father, not because of him, and were visited by all manner of young people. Most importantly, on the train, from his perspective, on the train back from Santa Clara, he meets Martinez Campos again. Martinez Campos is not in a good mood because he's being recalled. He's on the train being recalled from an unsuccessful, nobody in Madrid is fooled. This has not been a victory. The rebels are across the Trocha. But on the way back, he sees Churchill and he tells him, we put you in for a medal for courage, for personal courage under fire, the Red Cross of Military Merit, and one that, of course, the War Office is going to say he can't wear, but you know Churchill, he wears it as often as he can. This is the only likeness we have. And we're not sure if, for formal reasons, he brought his uniform, his formal uniform to Cuba, or whether they took it from a photograph, one of which you've seen a couple of times in this. Note that he's promoted. He's always promoted. The Spanish are determined to show this in the highest light, that a senior British official is here. Nobody mentions ever that he's a second lieutenant or that he's just graduated from Sandhurst, and he's usually either knighted or made a lord. This is the rifle. It's an interesting rifle because, of course, it will be used as a main weapon of the Boers only 4 years later. So that round is a round that takes literally thousands of British and Commonwealth lives afterwards. We don't have his report. Damn. It would be wonderful to think we could find it, but certainly I haven't been able to find it. Okay, results. Only have 3 minutes, right? How many? 2 minutes. Look at that. You see what happens? Of course, the 2 things we all associate with him are the siesta. As the Cuban historians say, only after some of the rum cocktails that Churchill himself came to like. But Cuban historians suggest that they actually won World War II and possibly World War I, because since Churchill always suggested that the siesta was absolutely essential for his working those late nights and carrying on so successfully, and since he learned it in Cuba, and since without him we would not have won the war, hence Cuba won the Second World War. I hope they're not being entirely serious when they say that, but as I say, it's usually after a number of drinks as well. He did certainly get the siesta. However, he did not, I regret to say, I'd probably disappoint as many people as with the 1st of December story, he did not learn to smoke cigars in Cuba. He already had an account given to him by his father, who didn't want him to smoke, but understood he was going to. He was already smoking Cuban cigars before he arrived, but no doubt his skill at appreciating them improved tremendously. What's the legacy then? He, of course, reaches a major controversy as soon as he gets back to Tampa, because the American press is anti-Spanish, the British press is anti-Spanish, and people are wondering, and certainly if they followed the Spanish press, they would think so, that what in blazes he was doing there. I think for the reason I would suggest to you that really is a coming of age is the number of firsts that occur with this visit. It's his first public military analysis. He who goes on to do what kind of military analysis for how long? It's his first public political analysis, particularly international political analysis. It's his first adventure outside Northwest Europe, the comfort of northern France, western Switzerland, and the UK itself. It's his first experience as a journalist and as a war correspondent, which of course is going to bring his fame and his first writing for the public. It's his first sketching for profit, interesting given the presentation of yesterday and Minnie's passion. Doubtless that was fun for him, as for most Hussar officers and light cavalry officers. It's his first time he's a military observer. It's his first time he's in a diplomatic row, something he will get very used to with time. It's the first time, related to that he's in the press, not as a son of Lord Randolph, but he is himself in the press for what he himself is doing. It's his first military operation. It's his first time in a war zone. It's the first time he's operating in a second language. It's the first time he comes to the notice of foreign royalty in his own right. And perhaps much more importantly, it's his first time he wins a medal, he who is known as the medal snatcher, as they call it in the day, and that medal's for courage. It's his 21st birthday. It's his baptism of fire. This was a life-changing experience. And perhaps particularly interesting in that, and I'm finishing up, is that after this, he has a new model for how he's going to approach using Mama. He is now a man of the family. He's invited everywhere. He's complimented by Joseph Chamberlain. He gives talks on Cuba around the bazaars. He is consulted for himself and his own experience at dinner tables and is invited to dinner specifically. And he's also asked to write for the Saturday Review. Now, if you look at the other people who are in the Saturday Review, Jules Verne, Oscar Wilde, Lord Salisbury himself, Chamberlain, I mean, there are not many 21-year-olds, and there are no second lieutenants. So he's really become his own man, and Mama can certainly see that. And there's a new relationship with her and with other people. He's, as I say, invited to the best places. So to conclude, I would suggest that just as you see in this, well, you don't see very clearly, he goes back to his regiment. It really is my last point. He goes back to his regiment and goes on to India. Here we are. Notice that the commanding officer has no ribbons. This is really the Pax Britannica. There are only 2 majors in the unit who have any ribbons at all. But he and Barnes, the most junior second lieutenant, and another lieutenant do have them. Now, they're not allowed to wear them all the time, but they have them. They have been under fire in an army which has, generally speaking, not been under fire. He has achieved his 4 objectives. He's made some money, he's had a real adventure, he's had his baptism of fire, and he, if not the household word by any means that he will become after the Malakand, after Sudan, after the Boer War, he is nonetheless on his way. So I think it really is in many ways, and not just his 21st birthday, his coming of age. Thank you.